Imagine an entire millennium erased from memory. No wars, no inventions, no records, just an empty void stretching across Europe. In those first 3 seconds, your mind reels. What happened to 1,000 years of our history, and who would benefit from its disappearance? Welcome to our exploration of the so-called Dark Ages, an era often painted as a time of chaos and stagnation, yet shadowed by whispers of concealed knowledge and silent crusades. Today, we'll unravel how the fall of Rome gave rise not only to cloistered monasteries and guarded archives, but also to hidden streams of inquiry that survivalists of intellect nurtured in margins and vaults. Join us as we trace the currents of discovery, from secret scribes and clandestine guilds to Renaissance printers and today's digital archivists, to ask a simple but profound question. Was Europe's darkness imposed, inevitable, or something in between?
There are moments in human memory when the world seems to catch its breath and hold still, as though reluctant to witness what comes next. In the year 476 CE, the young emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer, and with scarcely a trumpet's fanfare, the Western Roman Empire quietly slipped from the stage of history. Imagine standing in the great forum on that day, watching empty chariots roll across cracked marble and sensing that a chapter had closed without a word of closure. The once vast machinery of governance, law and engineering no longer hummed along its accustomed rails. Instead, there was a hush. That hush was the first note in a long introspective melody, an era many would later call the Dark Ages, but which began simply as a pause. No sweeping conflagrations razed every city, no cataclysmic earthquake swallowed civilization whole. The fall of Rome was not an explosive finale. It was the gradual dimming of lights in an immense theatre, leaving rows of empty seats and sky-darkened stages. And in that dimness, we must ask, when the pillars of aqueducts and triumphal arches still stand, but the voices that built and maintained them fade, what remains of their story? Secular power had fractured, and in its place rose a quieter dominion. Cloistered monasteries. Monks, once cloaked in humility, became the custodians of written knowledge. Their scriptoria glowed by candlelight as they devoted themselves to copying sacred texts, yet every stroke of quill carried a hidden weight. To preserve one manuscript often meant neglecting another, and so the silent curation of history began. A treatise on geometry might be omitted if its arguments seemed too heretical. A compendium of herbal medicine could be set aside in favor of theological commentary. Each decision, made with deliberate calm, chiseled away at the diversity of thought that had flourished under Rome's open marketplace of ideas. Meanwhile, in the eastern reaches of Eurasia, a very different transformation unfolded. Court astronomers in Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital, charted celestial movements with precision, devising star maps that would lay the groundwork for centuries of astronomical study. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom became a beacon for translators who rendered the works of Aristotle and Euclid into Arabic, enriching them with new insights. Scholars in India refined the concept of zero and decimal notation, innovations that would later revolutionize mathematics in the West. Across Asia, knowledge spread like living rivers. carving channels through diverse cultures and flourishing in open exchange. Yet in the shadow of Europe's crumbling forums, monasteries stood as both sanctuary and sentry. They offered refuge to refugees of war and upheaval, but they also jealously guarded their scrolls. To request a text was to step into a sanctified chamber where choices were made not by scholars debating ideas, but by abbots and bishops deciding which ideas merited preservation. In that selective process, the timeline of human achievement tilted. Some voices were amplified, others were stifled, and as centuries passed, what survived in European memory was filtered through the lens of ecclesiastical taste. This was not the product of overt hostility to learning, few monks would have openly claimed ignorance, but of an earnest conviction that faith must anchor every quest for truth. The world, it was believed, could only withstand so much uncertainty before drifting into moral chaos. Better, they thought, to hold fast to the certainties of doctrine than to risk the unsettling currents of unbridled inquiry. But the unintended consequence was a narrowing of the intellectual horizon. Borders closed not with walls of stone, but with walls of omission, chapters left unwritten, arguments left unexplored.
And yet, even in that narrowing, the essence of Rome's legacy simmered beneath the surface. In the margins of illuminated psalters, scholars slipped in tiny references to Euclid's postulates. Herbalists in remote villages maintained oral traditions that harkened back to classical treatises on botany and medicine. Craftsmen building new cathedrals rediscovered the principles of Roman engineering, not through formal study, but by trial, error, and the silent replication of techniques passed down through generations. These fragments formed an undercurrent of resilience, a quiet reminder that knowledge, once birthed, resists complete extinction. Here lies the paradox at the heart of what we call the Dark Ages. Outwardly, Europe appeared suspended in a muted palette of faith and ritual, but inwardly, a subtle rebellion thrived. The human impulse to question, to experiment, to recall what had been seen once before. The world had not uniformly gone dark. It had merely shifted its lights to a different stage. And when that stage would one day expand again, the stories of astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy would return, transformed perhaps, but no less potent. As our gaze moves forward, the silence that fell over post-Roman Europe asks us to listen more closely. Not for the roar of armies or the grand proclamations of emperors, but for the whisper of parchment turning, the faint scrawl of quills in hidden chambers, and the soft footsteps of travellers carrying word of distant wisdom. In those whispers, we encounter the living thread that binds antiquity to what comes next. And in that continuity, in the ebb and flow of forgetting and remembering, we find the true measure of an age that was never wholly dark, but always in dialogue with the light that preceded it. In the hush that followed Rome's final breath, it was not the clamour of new emperors that filled the void, but the soft scratch of quills against parchment. Monasteries, once humble refuges for prayer and contemplation, quietly assumed a guardianship befitting the ruins of an empire. Their scriptoriums glowed by torchlight and dawn's first candle, and within these vaulted rooms, the custodians of faith made choices whose echoes would reverberate through centuries.
They determined which texts would survive and which would slip into oblivion, and each decision carved new contours into the landscape of learning. Imagine standing in a dimly lit cloister, the scent of ink and vellum heavy in the air. A single monk, robes drawn close against the damp chill, lifts a delicate fragment of papyrus and begins to copy its faded lines. Perhaps it is a psalm by David or a homily by Jerome, sacred words deemed essential. But when the same hand encounters a treatise on Galen's anatomy or a discourse on Euclid's geometry, hesitation flickers in the scribe's eyes. Does this knowledge serve salvation or distract from it? And so, in the quiet decision to pause and perhaps never resume, the fate of entire disciplines rested on slender judgments made under candlelight. Over time, these judgments formed a pattern. Theology took precedence. Everything else was assessed by its proximity to spiritual truth. Works that could be harmonized with Christian teaching survived, albeit sometimes repurposed. A mathematical proof cited to illustrate God's divine order, a medical recipe adapted as a remedy for spiritual as well as physical ills. Yet, texts that stood beyond the approved boundaries, the writings of pagan philosophers, secular histories of fallen cities, technical manuals on siegecraft, were set aside. Some were hidden in locked chests. Others were cannibalized for scraps of language, their substance lost to future generations. In these monastic vaults lay not only the seeds of preservation, but also the architecture of a mission. For every scriptorium illuminated by piety, there existed an equally deliberate effort to silence competing voices. Reports from travellers who had glimpsed great libraries in Constantinople or Alexandria described stacks of scrolls uncounted, yet such marvels faded from European imagination. By the 9th century, the average scholar in the West could name the church fathers, but knew little of Archimedes or Ptolemy. The map of knowledge grew narrower with each cycle of copying, its borders defined less by geography than by doctrinal acceptability. Paradoxically, this narrowing spurred ingenuity of a different kind. When compendiums of Greek medical law were unavailable, local healers drew instead on herbal lore passed down through oral tradition. When mathematical treatises were rare, cathedral builders rediscovered geometry in stone, relying on rules of thumb and apprenticeship. The absence of formal texts did not eradicate knowledge completely. It scattered it, embedding fragments in folk practices, architectural traditions, and hidden glosses in liturgical manuscripts. These fragments formed a web of private memory that resisted the Church's outward narrative of controlled wisdom. Meanwhile, the cloister's walls themselves spoke of a paradoxical continuity. Roman columns repurposed as colonnades, inscriptions chiseled into marble capitals, and repainted frescoes bearing Latin verses all testified to a living dialogue with the past. Monks did not live in defiance of classical heritage. They lived amidst its remnants, sometimes oblivious to their original context, but never entirely divorced from it. They slept in dormitories once patrolled by imperial guards, broke bread in refectory halls that had hosted senators, and chanted their offices beneath arches once raised to pagan gods. In this strange coexistence,
The very stones of Europe bore witness to both continuity and transformation. Yet not all preservation took place within cloistered seclusion. A handful of daring individuals, clerics in royal courts, wandering scholars at the fringes of Christendom, risked censure to translate or copy forbidden works. They did so with furtive reverence. A snippet of Aristotle hidden in a missal's margin, a fragment of Cicero slipped beneath gospel texts, a commentary on Galen scrawled at the end of a homily. When discovered, these acts could invite condemnation. At times their practitioners were branded as heretics. Still, the urge to safeguard a broader tapestry of human thought proved stronger than the fear of doctrinal reprisal. One such figure was the Anglo-Saxon monk often remembered only as the Scholia Copier, whose precise annotations on a manuscript of Boethius preserved commentaries later lost on the continent. Another was a Basilian monk in southern Italy who risked excommunication by compiling a glossary of Greek philosophical terms for use by students at a court-sponsored school. Their courage underscores a hidden current. Even in the depths of monastic control, the river of knowledge found fissures through which it could flow, if only in trickles. This interplay of suppression and survival raises profound questions about the nature of memory, whose voices form the soundtrack of our own understanding of that distant era. When we speak of medieval scholarship, do we refer only to the canon printed on vellum, or also to the whispered lore of herbalists, the measured arches of cathedral masons, and the half-erased glosses that hint at unspoken dialogues with antiquity? To reduce the period to a single narrative of darkness is to overlook the complex choreography between preservation and omission, between the written word and the living tradition that pulses beyond monastic walls. As centuries passed, the pressure of doctrinal conformity eventually clashed with the broader currents of trade, pilgrimage, and intellectual exchange. Crusaders carried back not only spices and textiles, but also philosophical manuscripts. Iberian scholars at Toledo's translation workshops made Greek and Arabic works accessible to Latin readers. Venetian merchants brought home Byzantine codices that enriched Italian humanism. The monastic vaults, once hermetic, began to disgorge their treasures, sometimes by choice, at times under external compulsion, and the tightly curated collection of Europe's medieval memory started to expand. But the initial act of selection, deciding which texts would live and which would sleep, had already left its mark. When humanists of the Renaissance proclaimed a rebirth of classical learning, they did so upon foundations that were both genuine and patchwork. They built anew with the fragments that survived, often unaware of the full breadth of what had been lost. And in that act of construction, they inadvertently reinforced the very narrative of rupture they sought to transcend. A story of darkness overcome by rediscovery, rather than one of continuous, if uneven, transmission. In this way, the monastic era was not a mere interlude of ignorance, but a pivotal chapter in humanity's ongoing conversation with its own past. A chapter defined by the tension between what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. The vaults that once confined knowledge ultimately prepared it for its later dispersal, shaping both the content and the contours of Europe's intellectual heritage. And so, as we trace the river of ideas from antiquity through medieval cloisters toward the revival of learning, we glimpse a journey marked as much by careful curation as by daring rescue, a journey that invites us to reflect on the power inherent in every act of preservation.
Beneath the grand narrative of division between antiquity and Renaissance flows a quieter current, one that never fully succumbed to the monastic gatekeepers. Even as Europe's scholars laboured over vellum by candlelight, seeking to distill divine truths from Holy Scripture, they could not entirely sever ties with the broader tapestry of human inquiry. In the narrow spaces where parchment met margin, and in the hush of nighttime corridors, traces of forbidden scholarship flickered like fireflies in a dark forest.
Consider the artisans who carved rose windows in Gothic cathedrals. Their geometric patterns did more than honour saints. They encoded proportions traced back to Euclid's Elements and Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture. To the casual eye, these tracings were devotional art, but to those versed in the language of lines and circles, they spoke of an inherited technical literacy, preserved surreptitiously in masons' guilds. These guilds, though not overtly scholarly, served as repositories of techniques that paralleled the lost treatises once copied in monastic scriptoria. Without a single Latin word written, they carried forward a living mathematics.
In secluded valleys of the Alps and Pyrenees, small communities of herbalists and practical philosophers compiled apothecaries' manuals in local dialects, embedding classical medical wisdom beneath vernacular phrases. They described the curative properties of belladonna and digitalis alongside Christian prayers, creating a hybrid tradition that scholarship later labelled folk medicine. Yet these manuals, passed palm to palm, embodied a continuity of knowledge that neither church nor state could fully eradicate. Along the Mediterranean, merchants and sailors became unexpected vectors of intellectual exchange. A Genoese trader returning from Alexandria might slip a scroll of Ptolemy into his chest, then share its secrets discreetly with a curious patron in Marseille. Across ports, the cargo of cargoes often included charts of star positions, recipes for gunpowder, and papyrus fragments of Aristotelian logic. These fragments found their way into the hands of scholars who, though constrained by orthodoxy, recognized the tantalizing promise of a broader worldview. Thus, commerce became a silent partner in the reclamation of human thought. Within the cloister walls themselves, a subtle rebellion unfolded among younger monks. Apprentices, taught to recite passages from Psalms, also encountered scraps of secular discourse slipped under the locks of chests. Some took great risks, learning Greek or Arabic from Muslim scholars who had settled in Sicily and southern Italy. They wrote marginal glosses in Latin Bibles, translating philosophical terms into unfamiliar tongues. When superiors discovered these glosses, the scribes often navigated accusations of heresy by reframing their work as tools for deeper theological reflection. In so doing, they preserved seeds of cross-cultural learning that would later blossom in cathedral schools. Not all currents ran toward Europe. From the east, a trickle of ideas flowed through the Silk Road's dusty corridors, touching Andalusia's libraries and reaching Bologna's emerging universities. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, Al-Khwarizmi's algebraic treatises, and Avicenna's commentaries on Aristotle formed the bedrock of scholasticism. And yet, These texts came not as gifts, but as contraband, imported under the watchful eye of censors, translated in secret workshops, and annotated with caveats to satisfy doctrinal overseers. Even so, the force of their concepts, ideas of atom and void, solutions of quadratic equations, and articulations of logic, could not be muted. By the 13th century, a new generation of thinkers, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, took these hidden streams and wove them into grand theological syntheses. Aquinas argued that reason and faith were two wings lifting the soul toward truth. Bacon championed experimental inquiry as a companion to scriptural study. Albertus Magnus traversed the forests of Germany in search of plants whose properties illuminated both natural philosophy and creation's divine design. These figures stand at the threshold of a transformation. They made explicit what had long persisted implicitly, bringing the buried currents of knowledge into the light of universities. This emergence was neither sudden nor uniform. In some regions, scholastic debates raged over the legitimacy of using astrology to predict harvests. In others, guilds resisted the influx of book learning, favoring craft traditions honed by generations of practice. Yet the pattern was clear. The more rigid the guardianship of orthodoxy, the more inventive its challengers became in preserving and extending the human quest to understand. The monastic vaults, once feared as the black holes of knowledge, had unwittingly incubated a silent rebellion, one that did not overthrow authority with arms, but did so with ideas. If we step back from the grand edifices of cathedrals and the lofty halls of medieval universities, we see a web of interconnections between shepherds marking the heavens on cave walls, merchants cataloguing distant charts, herbalists documenting plant lore, and monks marginally glossing philosophical fragments. The Dark Ages, in this light, emerge not as a uniform pole, but as a complex interplay of control and ingenuity, of suppression and subversion. Each hidden stream, no matter how small, contributed to the resurgence of learning that would reshape Europe and, ultimately, the world. As this exploration continues, we must listen not only for the loud proclamations of kings and popes, but for the soft scrawls in margins, the few surviving lines of verse in local tongues, the well-worn recipe books hidden under mattresses, and the carved symbols in stone that refuse to be forgotten. In these whispers and carvings, the history of thought reveals its true vitality, an enduring refusal to remain silent, a testament to the indomitable spirit of inquiry. As the 13th century unfurled, the contours of medieval life were shaped not only by the grand cathedrals that pierced the sky, but by the invisible boundaries that governed thought. Within those boundaries, a quiet alchemy took place, the interplay of silence and sound that defined which ideas could be spoken aloud and which were forced into hushed corridors. It is here, in the whispered debates of university cloisters, the guarded conversations in courtly chambers, and the murmur of clandestine gatherings, that the next chapter of our story unfolds. In the dim glow of Siena's studium, students of law and theology engaged in disputations that often skirted the limits of orthodoxy. They debated whether virtue could be measured on a scale, whether the natural world bore its own moral logic, or whether any truth not explicitly affirmed in Scripture was suspect. These disputations, rigorous in form yet charged with risk, became incubators for nuanced thought. A harshly worded annotation might be struck from a margin, but the argument itself, once voiced, could not be entirely erased from memory. Meanwhile, in the bustling courts of Paris and Bologna, itinerant scholars introduced manuscripts from distant lands, some bearing diagrams of gear-driven clocks and astrolabes, others inscribed with treatises on optics and perspective. Patrons, bishops, dukes, and wealthy merchants recognized the prestige of hosting such texts and in return provided protection for their keepers. Here, sound and silence found a delicate equilibrium. A scholar might teach the mechanics of lens grinding to a trusted few while publicly emphasizing its theological implications, thus preserving the pursuit of knowledge under a mantle of acceptable purpose. Beyond Europe's northern heartlands, in the eastern frontier of the Byzantine sphere, monastic communities kept alive a rich manuscript tradition. In Mount Athos, the austere silence of hermitages masked ongoing efforts to copy and comment on both sacred and secular Greek works. A monk's vow of silence did not extend to the scratching of reed pens across parchment. Indeed, some disciplines thrived precisely because their transcription was deemed a pious act. In these rocky sanctuaries, glosses on Ptolemy coexisted with hymnals, and the canonical hours echoed against walls that sheltered centuries of unbroken scholarship. Yet even as archives swelled with parchment, the broader world remained hungry for practical innovation. Ironworkers in the Rhine Valley experimented with water-powered hammers and bellows, improving metalwork techniques that traced their lineage to Roman engineering. Windmills dotted the plains of northern Europe, harnessing elemental force in ways that owed much to Islamic designs introduced via Iberia. These technological shifts touched daily life, altering agricultural yields and reshaping village economies. Remarkably, they often proceeded with scant theoretical underpinning, as recorded in academic texts. Craftsmen learned by observation, imitation, and incremental refinement, embodying a form of knowledge that operated parallel to and sometimes beneath scholastic discourse. Religion, too, played a dual role. It both constrained and propelled innovation. Papal decrees could stifle the study of astrology as heresy, yet the same church sponsored building campaigns that demanded sophisticated hydraulics to supply water to fountains and cloister gardens. Cathedral chapters kept detailed accounts of stone transported, timber raised, and lead cast for roofing, a ledger of practical science nestled within the treasury of divine worship. The monk tasked with budgeting for these projects needed not only fiscal acuity, but an understanding of geometry and materials science, even if his public lectures never strayed from devotional exegesis. In this interplay, silence became strategic. It concealed the mechanics beneath the miracle. A water clock measuring canonical hours was explained in rhetorical terms of God's providence. A precision-cut lens was hailed as evidence of divine craftsmanship. By cloaking technology in theology, medieval institutions ensured that the flame of progress continued to glow, albeit under a controlled light. Innovators, whether masons, scribes, or mechanicians, learned to speak in coded metaphors, transmitting knowledge in forms that respected authority while slipping through the gates of censorship. It is in this alchemical dance of omission and illusion that the medieval mind mastered the art of coexistence. The philosopher seeking to reconcile Aristotle's unmoved mover with the Trinity wrote treatises cloaked in subtle qualifiers. The astronomer charting the moons of Jupiter might publish only star positions, leaving telescopic observations unspoken until the time was ripe. And the engineer designing siege engines would encode his calculations within prayers carved atop the ramparts. In these interstices, the spirit of inquiry thrived. When, in later centuries, the world would look back on the Middle Ages with caricatures of barbarism, it would overlook the sophisticated interplay that sustained both devotion and discovery. The medieval synthesis of silence and sound was not a betrayal of reason, but its shelter, a way to shield delicate ideas until they could flourish. From this crucible emerged the intellectual flourish of the Renaissance and beyond, yet its roots lie in acts of discretion wrought by individuals who understood that true knowledge often blooms in the fertile soil of what goes unsaid. And so, as we move forward through this unfolding narrative, we carry with us the memory of those hidden streams, of silent scriptoria, guarded debates, and noiseless revolutions of craft. In their convergence lies a powerful lesson that the advance of thought requires both bold articulation and necessary discretion, and that the echoes of innovation often originate in the spaces where silence reigns. By the 14th century, the pulse of medieval Europe beat to a new rhythm, carried on the lips of merchants, the hands of notaries, and the verses of troubadours. Words once confined to Latin manuscripts found their way into local tongues: French, Provençal, English, German, transforming the nature of knowledge transmission. This rise of vernacular literature did more than democratize stories. It loosened the grip of monastic gatekeepers and invited a broader populace into the conversation about faith, science, and the human condition. In bustling market towns, playwrights wrote morality dramas in the common tongue, blending biblical parables with contemporary dilemmas. Through these plays, villagers encountered moral philosophy woven into narratives they could understand without a university education. At fairs and festivals, itinerant performers recited epic poems that recast Charlemagne's court in vernacular verse, subtly weaving in observations on politics and governance. Such performances, though often looked down upon by ecclesiastical authorities, functioned as informal vehicles for reflection on power and society. Meanwhile, the scribes employed by town councils began recording legal codes in regional dialects. A craftsman in Florence could consult these records to resolve disputes, while a merchant in Bruges might reference them to negotiate contracts. As legal language shifted from abstruse Latin to accessible vernacular, the concept of accountability, both civic and moral, expanded beyond clerical courts. Communities developed a sense of shared norms, grounded in written statutes they could read themselves, rather than edicts perceived as distant or inscrutable. The transformative influence of vernacular theology cannot be overstated. Lay religious movements, such as the Beguines and the Lollards, distributed translated scriptures and devotional treatises that empowered believers to read and interpret the Word of God personally. These texts challenged the notion that understanding Scripture required mediation by the educated clergy alone. And while many such movements faced persecution, their encoded messages persisted in surviving manuscripts, carving pathways for later reforms. Literacy itself began to spread, albeit unevenly. Urban guilds established rudimentary schools for apprentices, teaching rudimentary reading and writing skills essential for trade. Letters and account books multiplied, and with them networks of correspondence that spanned regions. A merchant's ledger might bear annotations in Catalan and Occitan, Greek and Arabic numerals scribbled alongside Gothic script, testament to a living confluence of cultures. The ledger became, in effect, a microcosm of global knowledge, a testament to how commerce bridged gaps artificial scholars sought to maintain. Poetry and philosophy, once the esoteric domain of cloistered scholars, found fresh vitality in the vernacular. Dante's Divine Comedy, penned in Tuscan Italian, did more than elevate the vernacular to a literary pinnacle. It mapped an imaginative cosmos in language ordinary people could grasp, complete with characters drawn from classical antiquity, contemporary politics, and theological allegory. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales cast a motley pilgrimage in Middle English, granting voice to pilgrims of every station and exploring ethical quandaries through relatable storytelling. These works became vehicles for critical reflection, offering commentary on corruption, charity, and the mysteries of faith in the dialects of the people. The printing press, arriving with Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, amplified the tide of vernacular voices exponentially. Bibles, liturgical books, and scientific treatises could now be printed in mass quantities, bypassing the slow hand-copying of scribes. As print shops sprouted in Strasbourg, Paris, and London, pamphleteers distributed treatises on everything from astronomy to everyday household remedies. The speed and reach of print made censorship more challenging, forcing authorities to develop new mechanisms of licensing and control. Yet the genie of accessible knowledge could not be put back into the bottle. By the time Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, the ground had already shifted. His treatises, written in the German vernacular, galvanized a populace primed by centuries of vernacular engagement. People could read for themselves, debate for themselves, and challenge for themselves. The Reformation itself thus stands as a culmination of the medieval drift toward vernacular empowerment, a testament to how language shapes power. As we reflect on this rise of vernacular voices, we recognize a transformative truth. Knowledge cannot be contained by walls of parchment or gates of doctrine forever. When stories and statutes move into the tongues of ordinary folk, the monopoly of interpretation loosens. And in that loosening, the currents of inquiry surge forward, carrying within them the promise of new questions, new discoveries, and yet another chapter in the ever-unfolding river of human thought. With the onset of the 16th century, Europe found itself at an inflection point where the rivers of inquiry converged and clashed against the banks of established authority. Monarchs, caught between the rising tide of humanism and the entrenched power of the Church, began to patronize scholars whose works both illuminated and threatened the old order. Private studies in royal courts became experimental workshops. Roger Bacon's treatises on optics circulated among Francis I's circle in France, even as theologians in Rome debated whether his emphasis on observation undermined the primacy of revelation.
At the University of Paris, the Collège de France was established by royal decree in 1530, explicitly to teach Greek, Hebrew, and mathematics, subjects once considered secondary to the study of theology. Here, philosophers and physicians lectured openly on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, on the heliocentric models emerging from Copernicus's De Revolutionibus, and on the intricacies of algebra introduced via translations of Arabic manuscripts. The very existence of these chairs represented a subtle but seismic shift. Learning was no longer solely a gift bestowed by the Church. It became a pursuit championed by secular patrons who recognized its value for governance, warfare, and commerce.
Yet the path of progress remained fraught. When Nicholas Copernicus proposed that Earth and the other planets orbited the Sun, his thesis threatened to upend the cosmos as taught in Scripture. Published in 1543, De Revolutionibus was received with cautious intrigue by many, but provoked fierce debate among authorities who feared its theological implications. The work was initially dedicated to Pope Paul III, a gesture meant to frame heliocentrism as compatible with faith. Still, subsequent church censures and Galileo's later trial underscored the tension between new models of the universe and the established scriptural interpretation of a geocentric cosmos. Parallel debates raged in the realm of anatomy. The pioneering dissections of Andreas Vesalius, published in De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, revealed detailed structures of the human body that contradicted Galenic texts upheld for a millennium. Vesalius navigated ecclesiastical scrutiny, dedicating his work to Emperor Charles V, thereby leveraging imperial authority to protect his research. His detailed engravings and precise descriptions became indispensable resources for physicians, yet they also raised uncomfortable questions. If foundational texts could be shown incorrect, what did that imply about other long-held truths? The printing press accelerated these controversies. Pamphlets and books crossed borders more swiftly than any envoy. An anatomical treatise printed in Basel could reach Padua and Paris within weeks. By mid-century, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, 1559, codified a systematic attempt to control the content of printed works. But whereas in earlier generations censors had seized manuscripts in scriptoria, now they contended with a flood of printed pages, each carrying the potential to spread dissent. The Act of Supremacy in England, 1534, further exemplified this dynamic. Henry VIII's break with Rome not only redefined religious allegiance, but also reshaped the channels through which theological and scientific ideas circulated. Across the Alps, in the Swiss Confederacy, the printing centres of Zurich and Geneva served as hubs for reformers like Zwingli and Calvin. Their translated Bibles and treatises, written in German, French and Latin, challenged the medieval monopoly over Scripture's interpretation. Students studied in Basel under Erasmus, returned home with critical editions of classical texts, and engaged local audiences in discussions that straddled philology, ethics, and civic duty. In this patchwork of principalities and city-states, the interplay of vernacular, scholarship, and political autonomy created a mosaic of intellectual experimentation. Yet, even amid this ferment, authority adapted. Universities required imprimatur for new lectures. Town councils enforced censorship edicts. Printers registered publications with city officials. Scientific societies, such as the Accademia dei Lincei, founded in Rome in 1603, brokered alliances between scholars and patrons. Membership offered both prestige and protection, creating enclaves where inquiry could proceed under collective safeguards. Galileo's membership, for example, gave him an audience within the papal court, even as his Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi was condemned elsewhere. In these crossroads of authority, the architecture of knowledge evolved. The patronage networks, the academic charters, the licensing bodies, and the burgeoning concept of peer review. While these structures could suppress individual works, they also provided frameworks within which collective validation and critique could occur. By end of the century, the Royal Society in England and the Académie des Sciences in France would formalize these principles, ushering in an era where knowledge was advanced by collaborative verification rather than solely by doctrinal approval. Thus, at the juncture between medieval custodianship and modern scientific institutions, Europe navigated a complex landscape of patronage and prohibition, of progress sanctioned and progress prescribed. And through it all, the river of inquiry, fed by the hidden streams and vernacular voices of earlier centuries, continued its course, gradually carving a new valley into which human thought could flow freely. In the smoky glow of port taverns and the hushed libraries of emerging academies, the world's edges began to shift under the steady hands of navigators, cartographers, and natural philosophers. By the late 16th century, vessels flying the banners of Portugal, Spain, England, and the Netherlands no longer hugged familiar shores. They pressed onward into seas uncharted by Ptolemaic conspectuses, guided by astrolabes, whose heritage traced to Arabic scholars, and by star charts compiled in distant Chinese courts. Each return from these voyages brought back more than pepper, silk, or gold. It delivered meticulous logs, sketches of unfamiliar coastlines, and the sharp-eyed notes of sailors who observed currents, winds, and wildlife with a new, almost scientific rigor.
At the desks of mapmakers in Amsterdam and Antwerp, these nautical logs were transformed into maps that defied the static geography of ancient texts. Gerardus Mercator, in 1569, unveiled his projection, a bold reimagining of the globe that rendered compass courses, those lifelines of mariners, as straight lines. Skeptics steeped in classical orthodoxy bristled at such departures, yet Mercator's charts soon became indispensable at sea. They invited not only seafarers, but citizens of every port city to imagine a world alive with movement and discovery, an ever-evolving sphere rather than a relic locked in stone. Meanwhile, across Europe's burgeoning botanical gardens, new life took form. Ships laden with plant specimens from the Americas, Africa, and Asia transplanted vibrant blooms into greenhouses in Padua and Paris.
Naturalists like Ulysses Aldrovandi and Carolus Clusius catalogued these species with painstaking detail, producing folios where each leaf and petal was rendered with both scientific precision and artistic flourish. Their work did more than expand horticultural knowledge. It challenged medieval herbals that had long subsisted on classical authority, insisting that observation, seeing with one's own eyes, must guide classification and cure. Parallel to these terrestrial discoveries, the heavens themselves yielded secrets. Johannes Kepler, poring over Tycho Brahe's extensive observations, recognized that the planets traced ellipses rather than perfect circles. His formulation of planetary laws in the early 1600s shattered centuries of Aristotelian dogma, prompting both admiration and deep consternation. Yet whereas medieval censors had once excised contested passages from manuscripts, Kepler's findings were printed and disseminated widely, propelled by the same presses that had spread vernacular Bibles and pamphlets of reform. The cabinets of curiosity that sprang up in merchant mansions and princely courts brought these disparate strands together. One might enter a London gentleman's collection and find an astrolabe beside a pressed orchid, a compass next to a cured alligator hide, and framed sea charts paired with ethnographic sketches of distant peoples. In that eclectic display, the boundaries between art, science, and exploration blurred. Every object whispered of voyages, experiments, and cross-cultural encounters that had transcended medieval walls. Yet these triumphs of mapping and cataloguing rested on foundations both grand and humble. Indigenous pilots in the Caribbean guided Spanish ships through treacherous reefs. West African navigators taught Portuguese mariners the patterns of tides. Arabic-speaking scholars in Sicily preserved treatises that informed Mediterranean chart-making, and countless ship's carpenters refined hull designs through hands-on trial. Their names rarely appear in printed atlases, but their expertise echoed through every stroke of ink and every datum logged in seafaring journals. By the mid-17th century, as empires consolidated their holdings overseas, maps became instruments of both knowledge and power. Admiralty schools in Lisbon and Amsterdam taught young officers to read Mercator's grids as eagerly as classical students studied Cicero's rhetoric. Colonial governors consulted nautical charts to plan outposts. Merchants calculated trade routes by longitudes refined through lunar observations. The very notion of a global economy was born from those precise measurements of latitude and longitude, a technical achievement that sprang from centuries of hidden scholarship and incremental innovation. In every cloister where medieval monks once censored scrolls, there now stood observatories, botanical labs, and printing presses. The river of inquiry, once dammed by doctrinal gates and silent scriptoria, had burst free, flooding every facet of intellectual and practical life. Yet even as it rushed forward, it carried sediment from the past. The geometric patterns in Gothic tracery, the oral lore of herbalists, the glosses on Greek manuscripts passed in secret, the mechanics of water wheels and bellows developed under monastic auspices. These layers of tradition and experimentation coalesced into a new cartography of understanding, one that encompassed earth, sea, and sky.
To trace this chapter is to recognize that mapping the uncharted was never simply a matter of planting flags or claiming territory. It was a profound exercise in reimagining the boundaries of possibility, in weaving together voices from cloister vaults, marketplace guilds, crowded port taverns, and distant villages. Each map, each specimen drawing, each celestial calculation bore within it the legacy of hidden streams of knowledge, streams that had defied erasure, crossed linguistic divides, and prepared the world for an age defined by curiosity made manifest. As this section draws to a close, we see in these echoes of discovery a testament to the enduring human impulse to explore, to record, and to share. The atlas of the world expanded not merely by new coastlines traced, but by the cumulative courage to question, to travel, and to observe. And in that collective enterprise, the story of the Dark Ages finds its richest counterpoint, not in darkness, but in the steady accumulation of insights that would light the path to modernity. In the pale glow of early 19th century lanterns, scholars pored over the layers of time like geologists examining sedimentary strata, each stratum revealing distinct shifts in the human story. Yet if we invert that perspective, gazing instead from the 17th century dawn toward the medieval twilight, we catch sight of the first rays of what would become the Enlightenment. This was neither an abrupt eruption of reason nor a wholesale rejection of tradition, but a careful emergence, buoyed by centuries of hidden inquiry and sudden skyward gazes. Picture a room in mid-17th century London, its walls lined with leather-bound tomes and its shelves crowded with brass instruments glinting in candlelight. Here, members of the newly formed Royal Society, men like Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, and later Isaac Newton, gathered not to debate dogma, but to witness experiments. Boyle's air pump hissed and crackled, demonstrating that a vacuum could in fact exist contrary to Aristotelian denial. Hooke's microscope revealed a microscopic universe of little animals in a drop of water. And Newton, scribbling under that same dim flame, would soon articulate gravity as a universal force. Their methods, observation, measurement, replication, formed a stark contrast to the selective copying of medieval scriptoria. Instead of preserving only what served doctrine, they sought whatever the instruments revealed. Yet this empirical turn did not flourish in isolation. It was rooted in a deep, if often unspoken, lineage. The water-powered hammers of the Middle Ages, the marginal glosses on Ptolemaic manuscripts, the rose window geometries, they all contributed to a sensibility that valued hands-on engagement with reality. When Boyle curated his chemical experiments, he walked in the footsteps of Paracelsian alchemists. When Hooke plotted microscopic structures, he extended the work of guild masons who once measured stone ratios by eye. When Newton formulated the calculus, he built upon the foundations of Islamic mathematicians whose algebra thrived in Toledo long ago. At the same time, print culture exploded with alacrity. Scientific journals like the Philosophical Transactions began to appear in 1665, offering detailed accounts of experiments, diagrams of apparatus, and lively debates over interpretation.
where medieval censors once clipped margins or locked away scrolls, now editors policed accuracy and rigor. The peer review model, still in its infancy, asserted that knowledge advanced not by decree but by scrutiny. Errors were not heresies to be burned, but puzzles to be solved. Meanwhile, beyond the halls of the learned, Enlightenment ideas seeped into coffee houses, salons, and public squares. In Paris, salons led by patrons such as Madame de Rambouillet welcomed women and men alike to discuss astronomy alongside poetry. In Edinburgh, the seeds of medical progress for which Vesalius once risked censure now flourished in teaching hospitals where bodies were dissected openly. This democratization of knowledge, building on the vernacular spread of earlier centuries, ensured that inquiry was not the exclusive domain of cloistered monks or select court scholars, but a communal enterprise. Yet the rising tide of reason also provoked backlash. The French Jesuits defended Aristotelian natural philosophy. Certain parliaments outlawed the teaching of Cartesian dualism. England's Act of Uniformity sought to curtail nonconformist thought. With each triumph of experiment, there came renewed efforts to contain its social impact. Proof that the tension between inquiry and authority, first kindled in medieval vaults, remained very much alive. But unlike earlier eras, when silence suffocated innovation, now ideas found refuge in republics of letters, distributed through clandestine pamphlets and translated into multiple tongues. By the turn of the 18th century, the Enlightenment's first light had illuminated not only natural philosophy, but the very principles of governance and human rights. Locke's treatises on toleration and property drew upon classical precedents, but advanced them through empirical observations of human behaviour. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws systematized the separation of powers. Voltaire's satires, born from vernacular traditions of subversive wit, daubed authority with pointed humour. These works, carried across Europe in print and conversation, signalled a profound shift, that the cultivation of knowledge and the shaping of society were intertwined. In this unfolding story, we see the legacy of medieval custodians transformed into the engines of modern progress. The river of inquiry, forged in hidden margins and cloistered chambers, swelled into a torrent that swept away the last vestiges of unquestioned doctrine. Yet it carried with it the sediment of centuries, precision in craftsmanship, respect for tested observation, the rich complexity of cross-cultural exchange that gave the Enlightenment its distinctive character. As this section closes, the landscape ahead glows with promise, but not without caution. The same tools that revealed the laws of nature would later fuel industrial revolutions, imperial expansions, and social upheavals. The challenge for our own age is to remember that every advance rests upon a foundation of curated choices, of what was preserved, what was shared, and what was dared to ask. And perhaps, in pausing to trace that lineage, we rediscover the humility needed to steward our collective curiosity into the chapters yet unwritten. By the mid-18th century, the whispered networks of scholars and the polished halls of royal academies were joined by a new, vibrant arena of ideas. Print cafes, penny presses, and the bustling debate chambers of public societies. The printing press, honed over 2 centuries, had become not merely a tool for copying manuscripts, but the lifeblood of an emergent public sphere. Magazines, newspapers, and pamphlets circulated ideas at unprecedented speed, reaching artisans in London's docks, shopkeepers in Amsterdam's markets, and itinerant preachers in the Scottish Highlands. Literacy, once a privilege of clerics and university students, grew steadily among merchants, craftsmen, and even country labourers driven by the hunger for news, fiction, and practical knowledge alike. In Paris, cafes along the Boulevard des Italiens echoed with animated conversations as patrons dissected the latest essays from the Encyclopédie, Diderot, and D'Alembert's magnum opus that dared to compile all knowledge in French. Here, an artisan could debate the mechanical principles underlying steam engines, while a retired nobleman mused on philosophical articles that questioned the divine right of kings. The Encyclopédie itself, though frequently suppressed by ecclesiastical authorities, circulated clandestinely in multiple editions, its very existence a testament to the power of collective authorship and the resilience of ideas. Across the Channel, London's coffee houses earned monikers like penny universities for the pence it cost to purchase a cup, and the wealth of discussion one accessed in return. Printers such as Andrew Miller published works spanning agronomy, astronomy, and political economy, often issuing treatises in serial form so that readers could follow arguments week by week. Newspapers like The Spectator and The Tatler blended commentary on manners with summaries of scientific lectures, shaping public taste as much as they informed it. In these pages, news of chemical discoveries appeared alongside gossip about the latest theatre performance, binding together the intellectual and the everyday in a single tapestry. This vibrant print culture posed fresh challenges to traditional authorities. Censors and licensing laws attempted to curtail seditious or heretical content, yet the sheer volume of printed material made comprehensive control impossible. For every banned pamphlet, 10 passed unnoticed. Anonymous broadsheets critiqued government policies. Translated essays introduced radical ideas from Voltaire and Rousseau to English readers. Clandestine newsletters reported on debates in foreign parliaments. The public sphere had become a marketplace of ideas, a place where authority no longer unilaterally dictated truth, but had to contend with the collective judgment of readers, reviewers, and vocal critics. The impact of this printed revolution extended beyond words on pages. Maps and technical manuals now reached wider audiences, empowering engineers to construct canals that linked rivers and artisans to implement new loom designs that accelerated textile production. Agricultural societies published crop rotation guides and livestock breeding manuals, leading to higher yields that fueled urban growth. In effect, the circulation of practical knowledge, once jealously guarded by guilds or confined to Latin treatises, became a catalyst for economic transformation and social mobility. Yet the expansion of the public sphere also revealed its tensions. Debates over religious toleration, press freedom, and the rights of man sparked pamphlet wars that sometimes degraded into slander and libel.
Governments alternated between accommodating the demands of an informed citizenry and cracking down on dangerous publications. The pulse of innovation now beat in tandem with the drum of politics, as print culture became inextricably linked to the struggles for representation, accountability, and the definition of citizenship itself. By century's end, the same pamphlets that disseminated Newtonian physics and Linnaean taxonomy also carried revolutionary sentiments across the Atlantic. Colonists in North America read pamphlets on natural rights that echoed English debates on property and governance. When Thomas Paine penned Common Sense in 1776, he harnessed the vernacular and the network of print shops to inspire an entire continent toward independence. In so doing, he demonstrated that the public sphere, once a niche domain of coffeehouses and salons, had become the forge of political transformation. In tracing this chapter, we see how the cumulative effects of technological innovation, vernacular literature, and expanding literacy forged a new civic landscape. The printed word, once a silent asset in monastic vaults, now clamoured in public squares and private parlours alike. Knowledge no longer flowed solely from scholar to disciple, but from printer to reader to citizen. And as the 19th century dawned, it carried with it the promise and the peril of empowering every individual to both learn and to shape the world. The hum of machinery began to pulse through Europe's heartlands as the 18th century waned, carrying the promise of a new era in which human ingenuity would reshape landscapes and livelihoods alike. No longer confined to the pens of scholars or the discourse of salons alone, knowledge now powered steam engines, wove wrought iron bridges, and mechanized textile looms. This was the age when the theories debated in coffee houses and printed in pamphlets converged with the practical demands of burgeoning urban centres, forging a symbiotic relationship between scientific discovery and industrial application. In the damp glow of a Birmingham workshop, a craftsman named Edward Jenner might have been perfecting the machinery for his small-scale foundry, unaware that his contemporary across the channel, James Watt, was refining the steam engine to pump water from coal mines with unprecedented efficiency. Watt's patent of 1769, granted only after heated disputes over inventors' rights, exemplified how legal frameworks evolved to encourage innovation. The steam engine, once a curious contraption demonstrated at a society meeting, became the linchpin of factories, mills, and locomotives, driving not only economic growth but a seismic shift in the human relationship to time and space. Meanwhile, in the textile districts of Lancashire, the spinning jenny and the power loom transformed the cottage industry into factory production. Mills crammed with rows of whirring machines belched smoke into the skies, and workers, women, children, and men learned to synchronize their lives with the cadence of this new mechanical orchestra. Scientific principles once confined to treatises on mechanics now dictated the optimal placement of gears, the precise ratios of pulley diameters, and the metallurgy of durable looms. Manuals describing these calculations circulated among engineers and foremen, often translated into multiple languages to meet the rising demand for skilled labor. Chemical industries paralleled this mechanical revolution. Factories producing sulfuric acid, bleaching agents, and dyes
built on the alchemical experiments of earlier centuries. Figures such as Humphrey Davy and Antoine Lavoisier turned qualitative speculation into quantitative science. Davy's isolation of sodium and potassium through electrolysis and Lavoisier's careful balance of chemical equations redefined our understanding of combustion and material transformation. Their papers, published in scientific journals and debated at society meetings, became blueprints for explosive growth in manufacturing processes, from soap making to pharmaceutical production.
Transportation infrastructures, canals carved through hills, iron rails stretching across plains, took shape in response to this fusion of theory and practice. The Bridgewater Canal in England, completed in 1761, slashed the cost of coal by 2/3, demonstrating the economic impact of civil engineering. Later, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830 with George Stephenson's rocket locomotive, proved that steam could not only haul raw materials but transport passengers at speeds once deemed unfathomable. Every new mile of track and every sturdy bridge demanded precise calculations of load-bearing capacities, material fatigue, and gradient tolerances. Calculations made possible by the accumulated knowledge of mathematicians and mechanicians dating back to monastic glosses on Euclid. Yet the industrial age also rekindled debates about its social and environmental toll. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, heirs to Enlightenment ideals, weighed the moral dimensions of factory labour and proposed reforms to safeguard workers' welfare. In Britain's parliamentary sessions and reform societies, pamphlets circulated describing the plight of child labourers and proposing limits on working hours, an early recognition that progress demanded humane application. Public health reformers such as Edwin Chadwick published reports linking industrial pollution to disease, prompting the first urban sanitation systems and the nascent science of epidemiology. Education systems, too, transformed in response to industrial demands. Technical institutes and polytechnics sprang up in urban centres, offering courses in mechanics, chemistry, and applied science that blended theory with workshop practice. Apprenticeships remained vital, but they were now supplemented by lecture halls and laboratories equipped with engines, chemical apparatus, and surveying tools. Literacy rates climbed as practical necessity drove working-class families to seek schooling, while universities began to establish chairs in engineering and applied sciences, institutionalizing the marriage of scholarly research with industrial application. Internationally, the paradigm spread beyond Europe's borders. In the United States, Samuel Morse's telegraph demonstration in 1844 and Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper in the 1830s exemplified how a culture of entrepreneurial innovation harnessed scientific knowledge for transformative technologies. Telegraph lines linked cities across continents, while agricultural machinery increased yields and shifted labor patterns. Governments funded observatories and geological surveys, recognizing that accurate maps and mineral prospecting were strategic imperatives for expanding nations. By mid-19th century, the world resembled a vast workshop, its economies interlinked by steamships, telegraph cables, and railway networks. Scientific societies and learned journals flourished alongside industrial associations and patent offices. The flow of information, once secreted in monastic vaults or whispered in academies, now coursed freely through open publications, professional conferences, and international exhibitions, showcasing marvels of machinery and chemistry.
In this dynamic tapestry, the legacy of earlier epochs proved vital. The clandestine preservation of classical mechanics in medieval scriptoria, the coded geometries of Gothic masons, the botanical folios of Renaissance naturalists, and the empirical rigor developed in Enlightenment salons all converged to empower an age in which humanity reshaped its environment with unprecedented speed. Yet the era's triumphs came with new challenges: urban crowding, labor exploitation, and ecological degradation that demanded fresh applications of science and sustained public engagement. As Section 10 draws to a close, we stand at the threshold of modernity, witnessing how the engines of change, fueled by knowledge both hidden and shared, propelled society into a future defined by both dazzling innovation and complex responsibility. And in that realization lies the enduring question for our own time. How will we harness the cumulative wisdom of past ages to steer the next revolutions toward more equitable and sustainable horizons? As the sun dipped below the smokestacks of the industrial age, humanity found itself at a crossroads not merely of technology, but of memory itself. The monuments of steam and steel, railway stations, factories, iron bridges, rose alongside libraries, museums, and archives that sought to collect, catalogue, and interpret the tumultuous passage of centuries. In this era of reflection, society confronted a profound question. How should we remember what came before, and by what instruments do we decide which moments deserve commemoration or omission? Across Europe and North America, scholars and civic patrons alike established national archives and public museums. In Paris, the Louvre's galleries, once the private collection of monarchs, expanded to display artifacts from Egypt, Greece, and the Italian Renaissance, objects repatriated by Napoleon's emissaries and by antiquarians, driven as much by curiosity as by conquest. In London, the British Museum opened its doors in 1759, boasting an eclectic trove that ranged from the Rosetta Stone to Japanese woodblock prints. These institutions embodied a new ethos, that the breadth of human achievement, from the pharaoh's tombs to the latest patent model, merited preservation under one roof. Yet this consolidation of memory carried its own tensions. Whose stories would these grand collections tell? In assembling treasures from every corner of empire, colonial powers also wove narratives of civilized progress under European stewardship, often downplaying the agency and innovations of the very cultures they subjugated. Indigenous artifacts, acquired through dubious treaties or outright plunder, populated glass cases, their original contexts blurred or erased. In the archives, record keepers prioritized treaties, tax rolls, and administrative reports, documents of control, over oral histories of displacement, resistance, and adaptation. Simultaneously, literary movements turned to the past for inspiration and identity. Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Goethe
look to medieval castles, folk ballads, and Arthurian legends, seeking in them the raw pulse of national spirit. Their stanzas evoked mist-shrouded moors and ruined abbeys, positioning the Middle Ages not as an age of ignorance, but as a repository of authenticity and emotional depth. Across the Atlantic, American writers such as Irving and Cooper mined Native American myths and frontier sagas, weaving them into the young nation's evolving mythos. In these creative acts, memory became malleable, an ingredient in the recipe of cultural belonging, yet shaped by the imaginative choices of artists. Museums and literature alike grappled with the question of scope. Ethnographers collected languages and customs, publishing grammars of endangered tongues, even as those speech communities receded under the march of industrialization. Folklorists compiled ballads and superstitions in rural England and Bavaria, preserving voices that might otherwise vanish. At the same time, archivists in capitals digitized centuries of correspondence, newspapers, and government records, laying the groundwork for mass access, but also raising new dilemmas of privacy and interpretation. The technology of memory evolved too. Photography, invented in the early 19th century, captured faces and landscapes with an accuracy no painter could rival. Daguerreotypes and cartes de visite circulated among families, fixing in time children's smiles and labourers' worn hands. Later, motion pictures recorded events as momentary dramas. The coronation of monarchs, the eruption of volcanoes, the departure of armies bound for distant wars. These images, initially hailed as objective truth, also proved susceptible to manipulation, edited, staged, and repurposed to serve propaganda or sentiment. Thus, the camera's claim to veracity invited scrutiny of how any medium, text, image, or artifact, inevitably reflects the perspective of its curator. By the early 20th century, mass media and public education further democratized and diluted the architecture of memory. History textbooks presented streamlined narratives, the rise and fall of empires, neatly sequenced revolutions, and progressive advances in science and rights. Civic rituals, from national holidays to parades, reinforced these narratives, embedding them in collective consciousness. Yet beneath the polished storyline lay contested memories, the experiences of workers in soot-blackened factories, the displacement of indigenous peoples from ancestral lands, the suffering of civilians in global conflicts. Many of these voices found expression in personal letters, diaries, and memoirs, sources that only later generations would mine to complicate and enrich the official accounts. In universities, historians embraced new methodologies, oral history, quantitative analysis, interdisciplinary studies, to recover marginalized perspectives. Archives, once repositories of elite correspondence, began soliciting scrapbooks, letters, and photographs from ordinary citizens. Community museums emerged, dedicated to local labor movements, immigrant neighborhoods, and women's suffrage campaigns. They challenged dominant narratives, insisting that memory must be plural, contested, and dynamic. This turn toward inclusive remembrance embodies a lesson first whispered in the margins of medieval manuscripts, that history is not a monologue, but a chorus. Just as monks once glossed disputed passages in secret or guilds transmitted practical law orally, so too do communities preserve fragments of their own stories in songs, murals, and rituals. The architecture of memory must therefore accommodate both the monumental and the intimate, the monumental column set by states and the intimate photograph tucked away in family albums.
As this reflection unfolds, we recognize that the choice to remember or to forget carries power. Statues erected in public squares shape civic identity. Commemorative stamps honor select figures. School curricula determine which histories become shared moral touchstones. Yet the very act of interrogation, asking whose voices we hear, which stories we elevate, and which we leave in the shadows, is a continuation of the centuries-long dialogue between preservation and omission. Looking ahead, digital archives and social media offer both promise and peril. On one hand, they enable millions to share memories instantaneously, democratizing the custodianship of the past. On the other, they flood our attention with a deluge of content, challenging us to discern significance amid noise. The next chapter of memory's architecture may depend less on brick-and-mortar institutions than on collective practices of curation, tagging, verifying, contextualizing, and ethically caring for the traces we choose to leave behind. In the end, the river of human memory flows through ever-changing landscapes, scriptoria and salons, ateliers and workshops, printing presses and data centers. Each age erects its own landmarks and watchtowers, yet every monument stands on foundations laid by those who came before. Section 11 thus invites us to consider our role as both inheritors and architects of memory, to honor the complexities of the past, to amplify silenced voices, and to build frameworks that allow future generations to ask the right questions of history's enduring echoes. As dawn breaks on the 21st century, the currents of human knowledge have swelled into a digital torrent, sweeping across every continent, every discipline, and every individual's life. Where once monks labored over manuscripts in candle-lit scriptoriums and scholars petitioned royal patrons to fund their experiments, now anyone with an internet connection can access a virtual library of billions of pages and hours of video lectures. This transformation reminds us that each age reconfigures the architecture of memory and inquiry, and that our own era may be the most radical reinvention yet. Consider the act of learning in this digital milieu. A student in rural Africa can stream a course on astrophysics from a leading university. A hobbyist in Southeast Asia can follow step-by-step tutorials to build a custom 3D printer. An elderly retiree in Europe can join an online forum to contribute to crowdsourced translations of medieval texts. Knowledge, once painstakingly copied by hand or locked behind institutional barriers, now flows with minimal friction across borders and social strata. Yet this ease of access carries a profound challenge. To discern credible information from noise, to navigate echo chambers, and to preserve context in a landscape where facts and opinions blend as readily as digital pixels on a screen. The digital age has also reshaped how we remember. Photographs, once developed in dark rooms and stored in albums, now take instantaneous flight across social media, accompanied by geotags and timestamps. News arrives in real time, often live-streamed, allowing us to witness events as they unfold. Archives, museums, and libraries digitize their collections, rare manuscripts, oral histories, recorded interviews, making them available to anyone with the technical means to view them. This democratization of archival material echoes the vernacular surge of the medieval period, but at an unprecedented speed and scale. Yet, with these advances, new questions emerge. Who decides which materials are digitized first? Which voices are prioritized for transcription and translation? How do we guard against digital obsolescence, where formats and platforms become incompatible as technology evolves? In practical terms, a scanner might capture a fragile scroll's text, but what of its smell, its texture, the weight of its leather binding? And on the internet, what becomes of the uncounted ephemeral fragments, social media threads, personal blogs, live stream comments that reflect daily life yet risk vanishing when servers fail or platforms shutter? Parallel to these archival concerns, the tools of creation have expanded. Artificial intelligence can now analyze vast corpora of text, identify patterns in language, and even generate narratives that mimic human style. Algorithms recommend videos and articles tailored to each user, reinforcing existing interests and, at times, biases. Data visualization turns complex data sets into interactive maps and charts, revealing insights but also shaping the questions we ask. In laboratories around the world, machine learning accelerates drug discovery, translates endangered languages, and analyzes astronomical observations for hidden phenomena. These algorithms stand on the shoulders of centuries of mathematics, logic, and scientific method, yet they also pose ethical dilemmas. Who trains these AIs? Whose data frames the models? How do we prevent the inadvertent erasure of minority perspectives? The digital torrent, in short, is both a marvel and a test. It offers unprecedented possibilities for global collaboration, crowdsourced citizen science projects, open access journals, real-time translation services that bridge linguistic divides. It empowers activists to document human rights abuses, archaeologists to map ancient sites from satellite imagery, and educators to reach remote communities. But it also accelerates the spread of misinformation, organizes filter bubbles where falsehoods thrive, and commodifies personal data in ways that echo the contested power dynamics of earlier eras. In this context, the notion of memory expands beyond physical artifacts to include vast digital footprints, GPS logs, biometric records, social media archives. Future historians may sift through terabytes of data to reconstruct the nuances of early 21st century life. Yet the sheer volume demands new curatorial strategies, automated tagging, AI-driven summarization, ethical guidelines for data governance. Libraries and archives today are not only preserving texts, but building infrastructures, both technical and legal, to ensure that tomorrow's scholars can access, interpret, and trust these digital legacies. Moreover, The digital age invites us to reimagine communal forms of remembrance. Virtual memorials honor tragic events with multimedia tributes. Online family trees link distant relatives through crowdsourced genealogy. Interactive timelines invite users to contribute personal narratives to global exhibitions on climate change or pandemics. These platforms democratize the act of memorialization, moving it from grand monuments to participatory spaces where anyone can add a tile to the mosaic of collective memory. Yet, as in every chapter of our shared history, the digital revolution demands responsibility. Net neutrality, privacy rights, open access mandates, and digital heritage preservation policies become the new edicts that shape how knowledge flows or stalls across societies. Educators, technologists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens must engage in ongoing dialogue about the architecture of our digital commons, how to balance innovation with equity, freedom with accountability, and the exhilaration of discovery with the humility to ask whether our creations serve the common good. In the final analysis, the digital torrent is neither destiny nor doom, but a mirror reflecting our enduring impulses to know, to remember, and to connect. From medieval monks curating texts in hidden vaults, to Renaissance printers unleashing the power of the press, to Enlightenment societies debating experiments under candlelight, each generation has redefined the instruments of inquiry and the boundaries of memory. Now we stand at a new threshold, where bits and bytes trace the outline of human thought as never before, and where our choices will determine whether the torrent lifts us all or leaves some voices lost in its depths. As this section closes, we are left with a question that echoes through the ages. How will we steward this digital legacy so that future generations inherit not only the data of our time, but the wisdom to use it well? In our hands, the next chapter of human knowledge waits to be written. One keystroke, one upload, and one mindful choice at a time. As the digital tide continues its relentless surge, we find ourselves at a unique moment in history, one where the scales of power between custodians of knowledge and ordinary seekers have shifted irrevocably. No longer must a traveller endure months at sea to glimpse a rare manuscript. No longer must a village elder rely solely on oral tradition to preserve ancestral wisdom. Yet, with this unparalleled access comes an equally profound responsibility: to cultivate a collective intelligence that weaves together the strengths of every voice, balances innovation with ethics, and builds bridges of understanding in an ever more fragmented world. Consider the rise of open access platforms, repositories where researchers deposit papers free of paywalls, enabling a teacher in Bogota and a student in Kathmandu to read the latest findings on climate modeling or gene therapy. These platforms rest on principles first imagined by Enlightenment thinkers. The idea that knowledge, once discovered, belongs to all humanity. But digital open access is more than a gesture of inclusivity. It is a catalyst for collaboration. Interdisciplinary teams now form across continents, blending perspectives from ecology, sociology, and economics to tackle complex challenges like urban resilience and renewable energy transitions. In these virtual labs, code is shared,
datasets interlinked, and prototypes tested virtually before physical trials begin. Yet the very openness that fuels collaboration also exposes us to the pitfalls of misinformation and fragmentation. Social media algorithms designed to maximize engagement often serve up content that reinforces pre-existing beliefs, creating echo chambers that harden into polarized enclaves. In response, digital literacy initiatives have sprouted in classrooms and community centers alike, teaching citizens to evaluate sources, discern biases, and trace claims back to original data. These programs echo the medieval glossators who annotated disputed passages, not to suppress them, but to guide readers toward nuance. Today's challenge is to embed such critical thinking at scale so that every user, regardless of age, background, or geography, can navigate the digital expanse with discernment. Meanwhile, the rapid emergence of artificial intelligence adds another layer of complexity. Models trained on vast archives of human expression can generate text, analyze patterns, and even predict trends. When wielded responsibly, these tools amplify our capacity to solve problems. AI-driven analysis of satellite imagery can map deforestation in real time. Natural language processing can translate endangered manuscripts into living languages. But they also pose ethical quandaries. Biases embedded in training data can perpetuate inequities. Opacity in algorithmic decisions can undermine accountability. Addressing these issues demands a revival of the centuries-old tradition of peer review and public debate, adapted for code, datasets, and neural networks. Open-source frameworks and transparent governance structures must become as integral to AI development as equations were to Renaissance astronomy. In parallel, a resurgence of community-led memory initiatives is taking shape offline. Neighborhood oral history projects capture the recollections of elders who lived through wars, migrations, and social upheavals. Pop-up archives digitize family photographs and ephemera, creating local repositories that complement national collections. In these grassroots efforts, technology serves not as a monolith, but as an enabler, a means to document life's intimate textures and to elevate voices that might otherwise slip through the cracks of global narratives. Education, too, is undergoing a renaissance of its own. Virtual classrooms extend the reach of master teachers to the world's remotest corners. But there is a growing recognition that pedagogy must transcend the mere transmission of information. Schools and universities are experimenting with project-based learning that mirrors real-world complexities. Students work on community-driven research, collaborate on policy simulations, and engage in cross-cultural exchanges via video link. Such approaches recall the medieval guilds, where apprentices learned by doing, guided by both theory and hands-on practice. Today's learners, equipped with digital tools, are synthesizing historical knowledge, technical skills, and ethical reasoning in unprecedented ways. As global challenges, from pandemics to climate crises, demand coordinated responses, the notion of collective wisdom gains urgency. International research consortia share genomic data to track viral mutations. Cross-border environmental accords hinge on interoperable monitoring systems. Humanitarian organizations use mobile apps to coordinate disaster relief. In each case, the effectiveness of action depends on the seamless integration of diverse expertise, cultural sensibilities, and local knowledge. No single institution can claim a monopoly on solutions. Success emerges from networks of trust, transparency, and shared purpose.
Finally, we return to the question of stewardship. How will we ensure that the digital archives, datasets, and platforms we build today endure with integrity and fairness? The lessons of the past remind us that every archive reflects choices: what to include, how to categorize, who gains access. Digital curators must therefore adopt open standards, decentralized storage models, and inclusive curation practices that guard against both technological obsolescence and cultural erasure. Legal frameworks, from copyright reform to data privacy regulations, must balance the rights of creators with the public's need for access, evolving in step with emerging technologies. In weaving this tapestry of interconnected initiatives, open science, digital literacy, ethical AI, community archiving, experiential education, and global collaboration, we glimpse a new architecture of memory and knowledge. It draws on the hidden streams of the Dark Ages, the scholarly rigor of the Renaissance, the public debates of the Enlightenment, and the industrial innovations of the modern era. And as we stand on the cusp of this next frontier, we bear the responsibility to shape it with care, ensuring that every byte of data, every voice raised, and every insight gained contributes not only to progress, but to a shared vision of a just and enlightened world. In closing, we are reminded that knowledge is at once a gift and a trust. Each generation inherits a legacy of discoveries and omissions, of archives and erasures. The task before us is to honor that legacy by weaving each fragment, ancient and digital, local and global, into a living tapestry of collective wisdom. Only then can we face the challenges ahead with the depth of understanding and the solidarity of purpose that our interconnected world demands. In the early decades of the 21st century, the contours of knowledge and memory have expanded beyond physical archives and printed volumes into vast digital realms. Cloud servers, social media platforms, decentralized blockchains. As individuals and societies delegate ever more of their private and public lives to electronic records, a pressing question emerges. Who owns the data that defines our identities, our histories, and our shared heritage? The medieval monks who once curated vellum scrolls need no longer worry, but their modern successors, platform architects, policymakers, and everyday users, must reckon with the unprecedented power and peril embedded in digital footprints. Across the globe, nations and corporations alike stake claims on data. National governments enact regulations meant to protect citizens' privacy. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, stands as the most comprehensive example, while simultaneously asserting data sovereignty, the right to govern digital flows within territorial borders. Meanwhile,
Tech giants harvest user interactions by the terabyte, refining algorithms that predict behavior, shape consumption, and even influence political outcomes. These competing imperatives, individual autonomy, collective security, and commercial innovation, converge in a crucible of policy debates and technical standards, as regulators and engineers seek to balance openness with control. At the heart of this struggle lies the concept of digital rights, the affirmation that individuals should maintain agency over their personal information, from birth records and health data to the ephemeral impressions left by likes, shares, and geotags. Grassroots movements champion right to be forgotten legislation, in which individuals can request removal of outdated or harmful content from search engines. Advocates argue that our past social media posts, once youthful exuberances or missteps, should not permanently shadow employment prospects or personal relationships. Yet critics warn that excessive content removal risks erasing cultural memory and enabling historical revisionism, raising parallels to earlier eras when gatekeepers decided which manuscripts would survive. Open source initiatives offer one path forward. Projects like the decentralized web, DeWeb, aim to distribute data storage and content delivery across millions of nodes, reducing single points of failure and censorship. Blockchains record transactions immutably, ensuring that records, whether land deeds or scholarly publications, cannot be altered unilaterally. Community-driven archives, such as the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, tirelessly snap periodic images of public websites, preserving even defunct or revised pages for researchers and the public. These efforts echo medieval scribes' dedication to safeguarding texts, yet they extend the ethos into a digital age where preservation can be automated and distributed. Despite technological promise, challenges abound. The scale of digital detritus is staggering. Billions of emails, photographs, and transaction records accumulate daily. Decisions about what to preserve and what to discard must be made algorithmically, introducing biases about what constitutes worthwhile content. Machine learning models trained on dominant languages and cultures may overlook crucial material in minority tongues or local dialects. Furthermore, climate change and the carbon footprint of data centers underscore the environmental cost of perpetual digital storage. Every photograph cached, every video streamed contributes to energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, forcing society to confront the tension between preserving memory and preserving the planet. Legal regimes struggle to keep pace with these technical realities. Transnational data flows collide with jurisdictional boundaries. A social media post stored on servers in one country may violate privacy norms in another. Law enforcement agencies demand backdoors into encrypted communications to combat crime and terrorism, while privacy advocates warn that any such access becomes a universal vulnerability exploitable by authoritarian regimes. International agreements, from cybercrime conventions to trade treaties, attempt to harmonize these divergent interests, yet often founder on disagreements over human rights, economic competitiveness, and national security. In parallel, emerging technologies intensify the stakes. Artificial intelligence systems generate deepfakes, audio and video fabrications that can convincingly portray individuals saying or doing things they never did. As these tools proliferate, trust in recorded evidence becomes fraught. The same platforms that host authentic eyewitness footage also host synthetic fabrications designed to mislead. Verifying the provenance of digital media grows ever more critical, leading to research in cryptographic watermarking, provenance metadata standards, and blockchain-based timestamping. These technical safeguards, however, rely on widespread adoption and robust legal recognition to be effective.
Amid these global dynamics, community-driven models demonstrate how data sovereignty and digital rights can empower individuals. Indigenous digital repositories, curated by First Nations in Australia, the Sami in Scandinavia, and tribal councils in North America, establish protocols that honor cultural sensitivities, requiring researchers to request permission before accessing sacred knowledge or ancestral images. Such indigenous data sovereignty movements assert that data about communities belongs to those communities, not external institutions, mirroring earlier struggles to reclaim narrative control from colonial archives. They offer compelling frameworks for ethical stewardship that prioritize consent, context, and community benefit over purely technical or commercial considerations. Education plays a pivotal role in equipping citizens to navigate these complexities. Digital literacy curricula now encompass not only basic computer skills, but also critical understanding of algorithmic bias, data privacy, and civic participation in online spaces. Interactive workshops allow students to simulate data breaches and examine how personal information circulates on the dark web. Journalism programs train reporters to verify video evidence and trace deepfakes back to their sources. Such initiatives cultivate a generation that can ask the right questions about provenance, intent, and impact before accepting any digital artifact as fact. Finally, civil society organizations and multidisciplinary alliances bring together technologists, ethicists, lawyers, historians, and community leaders to forge holistic approaches. Conferences on digital preservation now include panels on Indigenous rights. Policy think tanks publish guidelines on sustainable data storage. Academic consortia develop interoperable standards for archival metadata. These cross-sector collaborations resonate with the spirit of early scientific societies, where diverse experts convened to examine problems from multiple angles, recognizing that no single discipline holds all the answers. As Section 14 closes, we see that the guardianship of digital memory is both an opportunity and an imperative. The infrastructures we build today, servers, protocols, legal frameworks, will shape how future generations access and interpret our era's stories, discoveries, and missteps. By embracing principles of openness, accountability, and inclusivity, we can ensure that the digital torrent becomes a shared reservoir of collective wisdom rather than a downstream of distortion. And in doing so, we honor the lineage of curiosity and care that has carried human knowledge from medieval vaults to the boundless expanse of the virtual realm. We stand now at the crest of an uncharted wave, contemplating a horizon shaped by millennia of human curiosity, curation, and invention. From the candlelit scriptoria of medieval monks whose hands trembled over precious vellum, through the whir of Renaissance presses and the clatter of Enlightenment coffeehouse debates, into the roar of industrial engines and the silent hum of cloud servers. Each era has bent the arc of knowledge in new directions. And yet, as this journey reaches its current terminus, our most profound realization is that the river of inquiry never truly ends. It curves onward, carving fresh channels and spilling into unexplored domains. In our age of artificial intelligence, gene editing, and quantum computing, the questions we face are neither simple nor singular. We ask, how do we reconcile the power of algorithms to predict behavior with the inviolable dignity of individual autonomy? How can we shepherd the revolutionary potential of CRISPR without trampling the ethical boundaries that guard human identity? How might we harness quantum uncertainty to solve climate modeling, yet ensure that those solutions serve the many rather than entrench the few? These questions echo older dilemmas between faith and reason, between authority and freedom, between preservation and innovation, but on scales both molecular and planetary that our predecessors could scarcely imagine. At the same time, the legacies of omission and erasure persist. Thousands of languages teeter on the brink of extinction, their oral narratives unrecorded and untranslatable once the last speaker passes. Vast swaths of ecological knowledge held by indigenous communities, knowledge of medicinal plants, controlled burns, lunar cycles, risk disappearing under the homogenizing forces of globalization. Digital archives overflow with data, yet curators must still decide what is deemed worthy of preservation. And as global connectivity surges, so too does the risk of cultural flattening, where dominant narratives drown out local nuances. Remembering this, we recognize that every triumph of access brings a corresponding responsibility to safeguard the fragile tapestries of human and natural heritage. In response, new forms of stewardship are emerging, hybrid models that marry cutting-edge technology with time-honored ethics of custodianship. Digital repatriation projects return digitized cultural treasures to source communities, who then determine access protocols in accordance with customary laws. Collaborative platforms allow scientists, artists, and activists to co-author open access publications that blend data analysis with personal narrative, acknowledging both empirical evidence and lived experience. Experiments in polycentric governance explore ways for local, regional, and international bodies to share authority over data, balancing the needs of individuals, communities, and the planet. Education remains a cornerstone of this next chapter. No longer sufficient to teach facts in isolation, schools and lifelong learning networks emphasize metacognitive skills, how to frame meaningful questions, how to evaluate evidence, how to navigate complexity and uncertainty. Students trace the genealogy of ideas, from Neolithic observation of celestial cycles to today's exoplanet discoveries, understanding that each breakthrough rests on the work of countless, often uncelebrated thinkers. They engage in interdisciplinary projects,
say, designing a sustainable microgrid while studying the cultural history of energy use, so that knowledge integration becomes second nature.
Perhaps most crucially, the mindsets we foster must honor humility as much as ambition. Every age has believed itself at the pinnacle of understanding, only to discover new frontiers that subvert its certainties. The medieval world thought it had catalogued creation in scripture and its glosses, only to learn of continents unknown. The Enlightenment proclaimed reason sovereign, only to confront the irrational undercurrents of human behavior. Today's era of data zeal risks believing that all problems yield to computation, only to find that wisdom remains rooted in values that no algorithm can encode. This final reflection returns us to where we began, with a recognition that knowledge is both fragile and resilient. The monasteries that once hoarded texts preserved kernels of wisdom through ages of upheaval. Secret guilds passed down craft techniques under veils of silence. Renaissance patrons turned exclusivity into diffusion through print. Enlightenment societies formalized critique. Industrial innovators melded theory with manufacture. Digital pioneers democratized data, but also grappled anew with bias and stewardship. Through each transformation, a single thread endured: humanity's irrepressible urge to ask, to discover, and to share. As this section closes, there is no tidy conclusion, only an affirmation of the journey's open nature. We conclude not with answers, but with a question. How will you, in your time and place, contribute to the river of inquiry that stretches from the dawn of written memory to the dawn of the digital age? Will you champion voices at risk of silence, build bridges between disciplines, or craft new forms of collective wisdom? Will you ensure that our descendants inherit not only data and artifacts, but the values that make knowledge truly human: curiosity, courage, empathy, and care? The horizon beckons, ever shifting beneath the currents of change. May we navigate it with both boldness and compassion, mindful that the next chapter, written not only in code and paper, but in every conversation, experiment, and act of remembrance, awaits our collective stewardship.